Episode 1: The Four Bankers Who Ruled the World. Imagine a world just out of the most devastating war it had ever seen. Cities destroyed, currencies collapsing, millions dead, and empires crumbling. And now, imagine that the future of that world, the entire global economy, rested not in the hands of kings or even presidents, but in the hands of four bankers. These men weren't elected, and you probably don't even know their names. But between 1919 and the early 1930s, they had more power than any politician alive. This is the story of Montagu Norman, Émile Moreau, Hjalmar Schacht, and Benjamin Strong, the central bankers of Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. Some thought they would be saviors, and others saw them as villains. But history remembers them as the lords of finance. And today, in episode 1, we're going to meet the men who ruled the world economy between the two world wars. The year is 1919. Europe is wrecked. Germany has lost the war. France has completely devastated. They technically won the war, but they're not in a good place either. Britain is broke. And America at this time, they're the exception. America is sitting on top of the world. So during the war, the U.S. had loaned billions to the Allies. These U.S. factories are churning out weapons, steel, ships, all the tools of war, and they are the lender to the warring countries. The U.S., of course, jumps into the war later on, but they were not as damaged as these other countries. And so when the dust settles, the U.S. wasn't just another player or another victor among the Allies. The U.S. was the banker to the entire world. So let's meet our cast of characters, okay, these four bankers. First off, let's start in London with Montagu Norman. He's the governor of the Bank of England. He's very eccentric. He does weird stuff. He wears disguises in public. He's prone to nervous breakdowns. The book, Lords of Finance, intro actually does a flash forward to one of his nervous breakdowns. And he's obsessed with secrecy, like to the point, like I said, he does bizarre stuff. Like he would travel to hotels in other countries, and he would make no secret that he was traveling, but then he would check in under an alias, and it would make people have all these weird conspiracy theories about what he was up to. He was an oddball for sure. But he's also one of the most powerful men in finance. And his goal is to restore Britain to its pre-war glory, no matter the costs. And it's important to understand where Britain sat in the hierarchy of the world at this point. You think to today, 2025, London's a great place to visit, but no one certainly considers the UK a world power. And then before the First World War, for a couple centuries at least, Britain was the foremost empire on Earth. Their empire stretched to every reach of the world. They had massive economic influence, the strongest navy, etc. So here at the end of World War I, they're not really in there where they are today in 2025, but they're also not where they were as the greatest empire on Earth. They're a little bit in limbo and trying to regain that past glory. So that is Montagu Norman's goal. In Paris, we have Émile Moreau, the head of the Bank of France. I'm not going to say Banque de France or however you say it every time. I'm just going to say Bank of France throughout this series. He is a nationalist through and through, and he is extremely suspicious of Germany. And that suspicion is not without merit, because Germany has invaded the French mainland twice in the past 50 years at this point. So he is determined to protect France's gold reserves. More on that later. He's obsessed with maintaining the gold standard and protecting France's gold reserves. And he is also obsessed with punishing the defeated, which is, of course, Germany. And we'll do a whole episode on reparations and the impact of coming down hard on the Germans. Speaking of the Germans, so let's move to Berlin. We've got Hjalmar Schacht. He is the president of the Reichsbank. Schacht he can be charming. He can also be incredibly manipulative. He's kind of a political survivor. There's some parallel, you think today, Donald Trump, right? He's a political survivor. He navigates the game. People think he's done. He's down and out. And Schacht's story does take a bit of a dark turn at the end of this. But he doesn't always operate in good faith. We'll learn more about the way he negotiates. He can be persuasive one minute and completely ruthless the next. And ultimately his goals are to keep Germany afloat while these reparations just squeeze the life out of the German economy. And that's an almost impossible task. So finally, our fourth character will head across the Atlantic to my town, if you will, of New York City. And there we have Benjamin Strong, who is the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And it's important to note just like today, there are 12 regional reserve banks, but New York is by far and away the most powerful. So Strong sits at the top of the American financial system. Strong he's pragmatic. He's a smart guy. He's visionary. He sees around the corner most of the time, but his biggest weakness perhaps is that he's just very ill. He constantly has bouts with tuberculosis that eat away at his health. And yet through all of that, he powers through and kind of remains the dominant force in American finance. And you'll also learn he becomes very close with Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who we introduced a few minutes ago. So we have four men, we got four nations, three of them victors, one of them Germany, the loser of the First World War. And, France, if I were to put the rankings here as far as who's in the best position, America's far and away in the best position right now. I'd say second is Britain. They have serious issues, though. Third is France. They technically won the war, but they are destroyed. Their land, their economy, they're in a bad place despite winning. And then fourth is, of course, the loser, Germany. So we got four men, four nations, and just one pretty fragile global economy. So these four men had one overriding goal. We went to their individual goals, but the overriding goal is stability to the global economy. So after the chaos of World War One, currencies were in free fall. There's a lot of money printing, borrowing, the things you have to do to finance a war like that. Germany faced hyperinflation. You've probably seen the videos, people carrying wheelbarrows of money just to buy bread. I mean, there's stories and we'll do a whole episode on German inflation. But to put it in perspective, in the US, we had at the height of inflation back in whatever it was, late 21, early 22, we were at 9%. And that's 9% per year. In Germany, you would see things like the value of the currency. You would see 100% inflation in a matter of hours. Meaning, if I had a buck in my pocket, I record this at 1 p.m. Eastern time right now. I go out to buy a loaf of bread at 4 p.m. That dollar might be worth 50 cents in 3 hours. Not in a year, not 100% inflation in a year, in 3 hours. And we'll get into that more. And then, so you have Germany with hyperinflation. Then you have France and Britain, who are just drowning in debt from borrowing to finance the war. And again, the U.S. was the creditor. The world owes the United States a ton of money. So the bankers came together to try to rebuild order, and one of their answers, I should say, is the gold standard. So gold had been the anchor of money before the war, and they detached from the gold standard because it wasn't feasible. They couldn't finance the war without doing it. They needed to print more money, expand the money supply. They believed that returning to the gold standard would restore confidence. And, the logic behind it makes some sense, right? If one US dollar equals a fixed amount of gold and one British pound equals a fixed amount of gold, then we can assume the dollar and the pound have a fixed relationship, right? On the surface, that feels like stability. It's not a ridiculous strategy to think that it would work in this situation. The problem was the world had changed. The war had destroyed these economies. And going back to gold at the old exchange rates, I mean, it's like I always drift toward sports metaphors. Imagine today's NBA, all of a sudden, they decided that we're not allowing dunking or three-pointers anymore. The game, it's 2025. The game has completely changed. All the fans love this style of play. And then all of a sudden, we drift back to 1950s white guys shooting set shots. I mean, it's maybe not the greatest example because the stakes aren't quite as high as the world economy, but you get my point. They're trying to go back to a time that just doesn't exist anymore. As we'll see over the coming episodes, the decisions these four men made around how to handle reparations, how to defend the gold standard, how to respond to debt and speculation with a capital S in the United States, they didn't just fail, they planted the seeds of the Great Depression. Montagu Norman would push Britain back onto gold at the wrong exchange rate. Moreau over in France would hoard French gold and worsen the imbalance. Schacht would try to game the system while Germany drowned in reparations. There's some lessons there. I mean, Schacht, the economy is so ruined. He has no incentive to be a good actor. And then you got Strong, who might have been, or maybe this is my American exceptionalism showing, but he might have been the one who was most capable of steering this ship. But we touched on his health issues. He wouldn't even live to see the storm hit in 1929. But for now, in 1919, the war has ended, and the world was still hopeful. These four men believed they could rebuild prosperity. They thought they could prevent another catastrophe. And in a way, that belief, or some might say that hubris, is what doomed them. Next time, we'll dive into the Treaty of Versailles, how a peace treaty meant to end war created a financial system built on resentment and debt. A system that the four lords of finance would spend the next decade trying and failing to manage.